Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. This week, we're joined by Kate Field of the BSI Group. We're going to be looking at the new 45003 ISO standard and what that means for psychological risk management and psychological health and safety going forward. Thanks for coming on the show, Kate. I'll start with a question that I ask anyone when they come on the podcast. What made you become a health and safety professional?
It wasn't a career I planned, like I suppose so many of us. I'd actually started my career more in vocational training. I'm a qualified lecturer, if you like, and I started my first full-time job working for a charity, helping disaffected and disadvantaged young people into vocational work placements. As part of that, I had to do health and safety checks on those work placements, and I did a bit of training. Started my IOS journey, and it was fine. I understood the process. I didn't sort of do that training and was doing those risk assessments and thinking, oh wow, this is a career I want to pursue. But when I was looking to take the next step and move on from the charity, I happened to see the job for being a health and safety executive inspector. To regulate the law. I kind of wasn't really familiar with them as a regulator, but it sounded like a really interesting job, particularly, the investigation side, learning about a legal process and potentially going to court. So yeah, it sounded like an interesting job. So I applied, got in, and I suppose the rest is history, really.
What part of health and safety are you really passionate about? Is it the more people side of things?
Yes and no. I mean, it's definitely at the heart of it is keeping people safe. There is no reason why people should go to work and be physically or mentally harmed. There is just no reason for it. But I think the thing that's really struck me about it, actually, I suppose there's two reasons. One is actually the variety of people you do meet and the variety of organizations that you get to encounter, certainly as an inspector, and I've worked then as a consultant because I've always enjoyed that variety. So over the course of my careers, when I've been in a single role with a single organization, although I've enjoyed it, I've always felt a little bit frustrated because I haven't had that variety. But I think the thing that's really kept me passionate about it is really understanding organizational culture, and particularly the role of leadership. So you might call it organizational psychology. It's always been that aspect because that's always at the root cause of all of the incidents, all of the problems, and trying to find ways of changing that culture and influencing leadership has always been the thing that's kept me most passionate. And within that, particularly then looking at the impact that poor psychological health and safety management has had, in manufacturing environments. It's much easier for the organization to get their head around guarding a machine. Actually understanding that it's the culture of the organization that is doing the harm from a psychological health and safety point of view is something organizations really struggle with.
Is it a relatively recent way of thinking in terms of psychological safety? Because I guess, from a non-health and safety professional, part of maybe my misconceptions about the field before I came into it was that it was more of a tick boxing thing with your checklist, as you say, guarding the machine as opposed to the person. Has it always been there?
So I suppose there's two parts to that question. I think sadly there has been a perception that health and safety is a tick box exercise. Go round and do your risk assessment and make sure the guards are in place or whatever it happens to be. Of course, that's not the case, and it hasn't been since 1974 in the UK when the Health and Safety at Work Act came in. That's not the approach that our legislation takes, but there's been an interpretation of that, which I think is really sad. In terms of psychological health and safety, no, again, this is for me one of my real frustrations, actually. It's always been health, and safety. We have been shockingly poor at doing the health side. We've got slightly better for some of the big health issues, occupational cancer, occupational asthmas, other occupational respiratory diseases, dermatitis, all of those sorts of things. That was part of what I moved on to in HSE. But actually psychological health and safety has always been part of that. Again, it's just been simply ignored. Back in when I was in my career at HSE, we launched the stress management standards, which are many, many years old now. And I helped in terms of the rollout of those, actually training up our own inspectors to understand it, but also I did a lot of talks and presentations to key sectors, particularly things like the NHS and education, where occupational stress, which is what we're fundamentally talking about when we talk about psychological health and safety, are real issues. So that's it's been a requirement for years. It's a requirement under the Management Health and Safety Regulations 1999, but organizations have fundamentally ignored it, which is why we have such a big issue. And I think there is a bigger piece as well. It's more prevalent in service industries. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen in manufacturing, absolutely does. But I think particularly in countries like the UK or other high income countries, as they've moved away from more manual and manufacturing activities, where basic safety is actually the main concern, then we've seen more of an issue and start to be created in terms of psychological health and safety. So no, it's not new. It's a constant frustration to me that we haven't grappled it more, but then we are where we are, and potentially we've got a game changer coming out with ISO 45003. So I'm always an optimist, actually at the heart of it. So I'm really hopeful that this new international standard on psychological health and safety starts to really turn the tide of understanding.
I think we're in an encouraging time in terms of health and safety, with the HSE Global Series, seeing the engagement we get with that and across the network. It's clear that there is an appetite for this sort of stuff because people want to help. You touched there on the new ISO standard. Can you give maybe an overview of that and where we're at in terms of the stage of its publication?
Yeah, so I mean, it's been really great to engage with the HSE Global Series and have those conversations with senior health and safety professionals and leaders in the field. And you're right, there's been a lot of interest in ISO 45003. So it's a new international standard providing practical guidance and examples for organizations to manage psychological health and safety. We use the technical term psychosocial risks as a way of describing these particular types of risks. And it was written by the same technical committee that developed ISO 45001. So that's the world's first global occupational health and safety management system. And 45003 is designed to complement and support 45001. So it follows the same high level structure. And it's really designed to bring out and bring to life the psychosocial risks and give organizations a framework to manage those. All organizations, all sizes, all sectors can use the standard. If you don't have 45001, you can still use the standard. It's still a framework for managing a particular type of health and safety risk, in this case psychosocial risk. So as long as you've got some sort of health and safety management system, you can still absolutely use it and understand it. It is a guidance standard, which is different to 45001, which is a requirements standard. I won't go into all of the nuances of the way ISO work and their difference in standards, but 45001 as a requirements shall, so you shall do something, so it is a requirement. In 45,001 as a guidance, it tends to use should, because it's like all standards, it's voluntary, but it's not a requirement standard. And that means that normal accreditation that you get with 45,001, if you seek certification from an accredited certification body, you don't get the accreditation badge that goes on your certificate, so UCAS or ANAB as two of the major ones. You still can have certification to 45,003, you just don't get that accreditation badge. And it also means that potentially organizations that don't have accreditation can offer certification, but I'd caution people on that. The reason that accreditation is so important is it means that certification bodies like BSI have to meet certain requirements in terms of the performance and the quality of our certification processes, and that's why accreditation is there. And BSI will be offering certification to 45,003, and we will be using all of the rules that we would normally follow for an accreditation process. So the robustness and the rigor and the integrity is still there.
Is there a chance that the standard may become more of an accreditation or a mandatory accreditation in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I think there's potentially appetite. I mean, one of the questions I get asked quite a lot is, shouldn't 45,001 cover this? And yeah, as a health and safety professional, my gut reaction is yes, it should. If we were doing health and safety properly, we'd cover psychosocial risk. But we know that sadly there isn't the understanding, and it's an area that is missed. 45,001 does touch on aspects of psychosocial risk, so it does talk about things like working hours, bullying and harassment, culture, those sorts of things, but it doesn't go into as much detail. And we're still in a situation where there is a need for supplementary advice and guidance that 45,003 provides. In an ideal world, what I'd like to see is that everything that is kind of incorporated into 45,003 merges into 45,001. So we manage health and safety properly as you're thinking about it across all the types of risks. But I think that's very unlikely, particularly when we think from a global point of view, the maturity of understanding in different countries about these particular topics is very different. So I don't know that we'll ever see that merge. We may well see, a desire for accredited certification to, again, ensure that robustness, like BSI, we are accredited, and we will use those same robust processes for certification for 45,003. But if we have other bodies who don't follow that same rigor starting to offer certificates for 45,003, then it could undermine the effectiveness of what we're trying to achieve, in which case, there might be a bit of a kind of a desire and a need to make it accredited.
Does the new standard incorporate practical ways that people can detect maybe workplace violence and how that feeds into psychological safety?
So yes, I mean, what I think the thing to understand is you approach psychological health and safety in exactly the same way as you do any other sort of health and safety risk. So you identify what the hazards are, you identify who could be harmed, then you assess how likely that is and what the consequences are. The approach is exactly the same. And in 45,003, it gives 3 tables, nearly 3 pages full of examples of psychosocial hazards. And absolutely, it includes violence within that. And then it gives some examples of ways that you can manage control some of those risks. It doesn't go into as much detail because obviously controls are much more nuanced. But yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, violence, physical, verbal, sexual, threatened, actual, is all part of 45,003. And I think, you know, you asked me one of the reasons, you know, whether it's been around for a long time, and I think work-related violence is a really good example of a risk that's been around for a long time. Some sectors have grappled with parts of it. So there was a real big issue I talked about when the HSE stress management systems came out. I did a lot of talks to the NHS. One of the causes of psychological harm in the NHS was the risk of violence, particularly in things like A&E departments, and they did quite a lot of work in terms of looking at different controls across the hierarchy to manage that risk. But it's really interesting talking to somebody who works in kind of more domestic care, or I saw it a lot in sort of residential care, particularly with clients that have mental illnesses or things like dementia, where, you know, unfortunately forms of violence can erupt, and actually, you know, I've seen the damage that that can cause to individuals. So yeah, you know, I think it's an area that can be addressed very effectively. In some respects, when I think about the range of psychosocial risks and hazards that exist within an organ, or potentially within an organization or different sectors, actually work-related violence is one of the ones we should be dealing with most easily, because there are very clear controls that you can put in place.
So we're looking after psychological safety. Does the new standard implement ways in which employers can maybe encourage their employees to take ownership of it a bit? Because we know, in terms of the well-being side of things, what people need to do in terms of getting good sleep, good diet, that sort of thing. Does the new standard look into that at all? So
yes and no, I suppose. So interestingly, it provides a definition of workplace well-being. And that talks about the fulfillment of expectations for workers. And I think, you know, there is still a lack of understanding about what workplace well-being should actually be about, but we'll cover that maybe in a later podcast. I won't go down that rabbit hole today. But in terms of the individual piece, I think this is really common misconception, and actually it's worrying me a little bit, the number of people I've heard sort of talk about this. When we talk about psychological health and safety, I'm hearing a lot of people say the emphasis is on the individual. No, it's not. it's on the organization. What form of psychological harm is the organization causing, and what are they doing about it? That is not an individual issue. You know, this is the same as something like fire risk within an organization. We don't put the emphasis on fire risk management on individuals. We come up with an organizational response. There may then be some individuals who might need extra support during an evacuation, in which case we might do a personal emergency evacuation plan. And the same would be the case for psychological health and safety. We have an organizational level response that actually meets the needs of the majority of people. But if there are individuals that need extra help and support, then we provide it at that level. But the emphasis is not on the individual to manage this. This is about psychological health and safety in the workplace, and what the workplace is doing to prevent it.
So I guess to round up, what's the one bit of advice that you would give to a health and safety professional, maybe high up, and they want to implement the new standard in the correct way, or as correct a way as possible?
I think there's a couple of things I'd say. I think the first, I'd give some reassurance. You know, it's an area that maybe a lot of health and safety professionals are not so comfortable with, and there's often a misconception that you need to somehow be some sort of mental health doctor. You need to have a doctorate in psychology. You absolutely don't. You know, this is about normal risk management processes, which as health and safety professionals, you know, is our bread and butter. This is what we do day in and day out. That process is exactly the same. You know, we are then solution creators in terms of identifying what the potential problems are and coming up with solutions to manage it. So the approach is exactly the same. So I think I'd reassure people that this is absolutely within your ability and your skill set. Approach it in the same way as you do for other health and safety risks as your starting point. You know, you won't go far wrong. You'll need to think slightly more widely in terms of looking at for your hazard identification, identifying the sources of potential risk. But the process is the same. And in terms of the advice for implementing it, it's the same for any health and safety initiative. Is you need buy-in from the top. So you need your leadership to be committed to this and give support. That's where it starts.
Perfect. Well, I think that's a great place to end the discussion on the new standard. We've covered some great areas there. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Kate. And I think you touched on there, we've got another podcast coming up on, I think, is it a new practical model that BSI has coming up on wellbeing?
Yeah, so we have just launched this week. Actually, it was last week. We'll just continue to promote it. A new best practice model on workplace wellbeing, prioritizing people model, and that looks at wellbeing in a much more holistic way, looking at what organisations really need to do to create that sense of fulfilment and meet the expectations of workers. So yeah, I'm looking forward to coming back and talking to you all in much more detail about that model.
Perfect. Well, we look forward to that show, and thanks again for coming on, Kate.
Lovely. Thank you, David.